Bishop William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president of Repairers of the Breach. On Saturday, Bishop Barber was awarded the King Center's 2022 Beloved Community Award for Civic Leadership. Bishop Barber, welcome back to Democracy Now! I also wanted to start off by asking how you're feeling as you announced you tested positive for coronavirus.
Well, I'm doing much better. Thank you for asking. I'm quite bothered, though, by all of the people that can't get free tests, and we still have not given people free insurance, even in the midst of COVID. So while I'm well, the nation is not well, the world is not well, and I want to thank you for having me on this morning.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This is a pivotal moment. If you can talk about the standoff in the U.S. Senate right now, not exactly between Republicans and Democrats, so you could ask why many Republicans are not supporting the voting rights legislation as they have in the past over and over again, but within the Democratic Party, with Senators Manchin and Sinema refusing to support a filibuster waiver carve-out.
Well, Amy, let me take a moment. You know, this past Friday, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, announced that we were going to, regardless of what happened, have a mass Poor People's Low-Wage Workers Assembly moral march on Washington and to the polls on June 18th, 2022. We're launching a tour, actually, announcement tomorrow, regardless of what happens. We're going to engage in mass action, direct action, nonviolent action, not just for a day, but for a declaration to declare that there must be a moral shift in this country, that there must be a change in power. As Dr. King said, the real problem that we've always had with these issues of voting is the fear of the aristocracy of the masses of poor and low-wealth people, black and white, coming together to vote in a way that fundamentally shifts the economic architecture of the nation. In fact, in 1967, Dr. King said, we must also realize that the problems of racial injustice and economic injustice cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power. So, first of all, we should have never decided to separate voting rights from economic justice. I was listening to your report a minute ago about what just came out about poverty. That was a fundamental mistake, I believe, on many activists' part and many Democrats' part to separate these out. We should have started saying we demand infrastructure of our democracy, which is voting, and infrastructure of investment in the lives of poor and low-wealth people. The next thing is we are intensifying now, but if we're going to win this, we've got to, number one, say we can't allow the government to set false deadlines. Our deadline is victory. We could have done this since 2013 when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. When in the middle of the Obama administration, we have to ask the question, why hasn't some of the intensity been before now? We have to ask the question, yes, Manchin and Sinema, but why haven't some groups, even some civil rights groups, pushed them hard in their own states before now? Who made the decision that we wait until now? Why, yes, you challenge Sinema and Manchin, but there are other Democrats, moderates, that Dr. King once called the worst enemies to the civil rights movement, who also have been weak on when it comes to end the filibuster. Certainly the Republicans and some Democrats have not wanted to move the filibuster other than Sinema. Why didn't we make the connection, the fact that 45% of the electorate in battleground states are poor and low wealth, 30% across the nation. So regardless of what happens today, we have a lot of work to do. Sinema and Manchin are acting like James Calhoun in the 1850s, who said you had to protect minority rule. They're not acting like Robert Byrd, because Robert Byrd actually hated this kind of filibuster. We must lastly raise the question, where's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce? Why aren't we criticizing them? All groups, civil rights organizations, everybody, because they're the ones that both are against living wages and against voting rights, if we're going to have a criticism and be like Dr. King, we have to go deep. What about the Koch brothers? What about the American for Prosperity? And then lastly, what do these bills actually do? I know they want to sell it as an end-all and be-all, but the new Freedom to Vote Act, which Manchin compromised down to, what does it do? What doesn't it do? One thing it does is it codifies voter ID for the first time in the history of the country. Not saying it doesn't do some good things. The other one, the Voting Rights Advancement Act, does it really cover states? Or how many states will be covered under preclearance? What's the formula? One formula said that you had to have 15 cases adjudicated all the way through the Supreme Court. Well, how many states can even meet that formula right now? And will it grandfather and stop the gerrymandering that's already happened? Was part of the game of Manchin and Sinema to delay all the way this year until bills got passed. So even now, if they change, they would have actually won what they promised the Chamber of Commerce and others. These are heavy questions. And it's great to come out yesterday and others, and we should, but we cannot allow the politicians to do politics by ceremonial day. And lastly, the president, we've been begging the president and his handlers to meet with moral leaders, white and black and brown and Latino and impacted people in the White House. To make this a black issue is dangerous. It's not just a black issue. 55 million people will lose their access to the polls they used in 2020 if we allow what's going on to continue. It's a democracy issue. Dr. King never framed this issue as just a black issue. He always framed it as an economic issue and a race issue, and we should be doing the same.
Well, Bishop Barber, I wanted to ask you, many would agree with you that even the current bills that will be voted on before the Senate have problems or weaknesses in terms of their defense of the Voting Rights Act. But it seems pretty certain that even these will be voted down. And the question is, what will then be the approach that the movement for voting rights should take? Clearly, it's into the streets, but would you support some kind of a legislation that would take portions of these bills and at least get something passed before the next elections?
Well, see, that's the politician's decision. The movement's decision is to demand what is right all the way, not part of our right, some of our right. It's amazing to me that when it came to the corporations, they got everything they asked for. They wanted $4 or $5 trillion. They got $4 or $5 trillion. Billionaires made $2 trillion in the first 20 months of COVID and are growing. When it comes to issues like poverty and voting rights, number one, we bifurcate them in a way that the forces of oppression never bifurcate them. And then we keep compromising down, 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 rather than fighting. And eventually, if we're not careful, it would be tantamount to Frederick Douglass accepting a long weekend as an answer to slavery rather than emancipation and freedom. So what the movement is saying is not only are we going to the streets, but direct action, mobilization, and not for a day, but for a season until we're going to massively engage in registering voters and pushing out voters in poor and low-wealth communities who can fundamentally shift the political realities of this country. We're going to put together a full agenda. We call it the third Reconstruction agenda. We now have 45 coordinating committees, 2,500 clergy, 200 partners. We've been mobilizing and planning because we never were going to just accept what the politicians throw at us. The tail can't wag the dog. It doesn't work like that. The reality is that when we talk about even the Build Back Better plan, Democrats should have never called that the most transformative. They should have said it was a step to attempt to respond to the fact that poor and low wealth people were the ones hurt the most during COVID. These bills, once they get compromised, call it what it is. Think about it. We have allowed Manchin, Sinema, and the Republicans to basically throw the memory of John Lewis away, throw the For the People Act that he actually wrote away. And Democrats should never have done that. We didn't fight hard enough on the front end. Many groups agreed with this delay. Well, the movement is saying there's going to be a moral reset. And let's do history. In 1852, the Dred Scott decision was passed. Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, they didn't quit. They said they emboldened and intensified their agitation. When the 1957 Civil Rights Act was passed, the movement didn't quit because it was so compromised. They began to push even the more. Right after the 64 Civil Rights Act, then we began moving toward the 65 Voting Rights Act. John Lewis, in fact, criticized the 64 Voting Rights Act and exposed the weaknesses of it. I don't know where in the world we have come to in this country, particularly in activism, where we think that the politicians set the agenda. We just have to go along with it. We don't criticize it. We don't show the weaknesses of it. We don't talk. That is wrong. You know, we cannot let the politicians, I don't care what party, just say, here's what you need, and this is the greatest thing you can have. No, we want all our freedom, all our voting rights, all our economic prosperity, and we want it now. And we don't know what can happen until we see the greatest, largest mass movement of poor and low wealth people in this country ever in history. And that is what we're moving towards putting together and pushing out now.
Well, Bishop Barber, I wanted to ask you the point that you raised that it was a mistake to frame the voting rights legislation as a largely a black and a brown issue. Yet you have millions and millions of white Americans who are not only still rallying behind Donald Trump, but believing his false claims that the last election was stolen. How do you reach out to the masses of white, working class, and poor people who really should have a strategic and interest for their own interest in the passage of voting rights?
Well, let's stop lying on poor and low wealth people. Most of the people at January 6th were not poor and low wealth. They were middle class and up. The data shows that. The majority of poor and low wealth people, 55%, voted for Biden-Harris. The majority of poor and low wealth people don't vote, and we did a study with Columbia University, and they asked why didn't they vote. They said because nobody talks about poverty and the issues that are really facing us, and even voter suppression. So the majority of poor and low wealth people have not voted. We did a study that showed in 15 states, if between 1 and 24% of poor and low wealth voters who are already registered were to vote, who haven't been voted, would vote around an agenda for their uplift, it would fundamentally shift the electorate. As you heard me say earlier, poor and low wealth people represent 45% of the electorate in states where the decision for president or senate was less than 3%. Dr. King knew it, that these masses are always out there. I'm tired of folks saying that they're not there. Dr. King said it's the aristocracy that knew they were out there, knew they could be unified, and that's why billions of dollars has been spent to divide us. And every time we get up and we try to frame this as just a black issue, like voting rights is a special interest issue for black people, rather than an attack on the democracy that includes racism, that includes classism, that has impact based on region. And when we don't connect the fact that the same person that are suppressing the vote. Also, Joe Manchin suppressed, for instance, passing the living wage in February, raising it to 15. He should have been called out then. We did. Many others didn't. They should have. That was a racist vote, because when he blocked $15 in the union, not only did he block 31 million Americans from moving out of poverty and low wealth, he blocked 41% of African Americans from moving out of poverty and low wealth. Dr. King never separated these issues. He said triune: poverty, militarism, and racism. Today, we say systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative, religious nationalism, and the denial of health care, which is why we have to have massive public education of what's really going on, because we've been lied to so much. We have to have a unified coalition of black and brown and white and young and old and gay and straight and native and Asian. And it's possible that we do not have a scarcity of resources or a scarcity of ideas. We have a scarcity of moral consciousness. We have to see the religious community come together, and they're ready. I'm telling you, when we made the announcement on Friday, they said, regardless of what happened, we've been building for 3 years underneath, putting things together. It is time for that body of people to come together that the greedy, profit-driven aristocracy fears the most, and that is the masses of poor and low-wealth people and moral leaders coming together to reset, and not just for a day, June 22 is not just a day, it's a declaration, not just a moment, it's a movement. It's going to be a season, not a day. We need a season. If it takes a whole year, 2 years of action and conscious changing and in the streets and nonviolent direct action and major public education and movement to the people to the polls, that's what has to happen. And people can't tell me what can happen because they haven't tried that. We've been too bifurcated, too separated. We've allowed politicians to do policies by ceremony and ceremonial days. That is not movement. And we must not allow that to be the end. And so I want to finally quote what Frederick Douglass said when he was asked 1 month after the Dred Scott decision, and he was told the abolition movement was over, nothing they could do. He said, what I do know is that the Supreme Court of man can never overrule the Supreme Court of God. What I do know is that this decision, as monstrous as it is, may just be the necessary link in the chain of events to the downfall of the whole system of slavery, because what I know is every attempt to ally and stop the abolition movement has only served to embolden and intensify its agitation. That's what we must have now, and it must be black and white and brown and Asian and Native and young and old and gay and straight and Jewish and Christian and Muslim and people of faith and people not of faith and Appalachia and Delta of this country, and California, Carolinas working together.
Bishop William Barber, we want to thank you for being with us, and we will certainly continue to follow this movement. Bishop Barber is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president of Repairers of the Breach. Reverend Barber was just awarded the King Center's 2022 Beloved Community Award for Civic Leadership this weekend.